Hello and welcome back to Officina Virtuale. Today we will start with our first assembly design. So in mechanical design, let's open assembly design. We've got this different icon here and we will start with this first icon, existing component. Clicking on this icon, we need to select our product, for example. And now we've got the different things that we can add. As you can see here, we've got the part that we already realized. So let's select base and let's click on open. And this is our first element. And now in our specification tree, we've got our product. So let's right click and in property, we can rename our product. Let's say Pulley, and apply and OK. So this is our product and this is the first part that we've added. Okay, now let's click on existing component. But this is the first part and we can use our first constraint. We've got fix, selecting this element as you can see here, and our base. We've got this anchor here, and that means that this is our fixed part. Okay, now we can add our second element and we can add our math 2, open. Okay, this is our part. We can move this part, and to move this part we've got this command here, manipulation. We can click on manipulation and as you can see here we've got different possibility. We've got as first option manipulation along a direction or X, Y and Z, and a direction that we can select. For example, if I click on X, I can move this element on the X-axis as you can see here, Y and Z, but I can select a different axis. For example, clicking on this, I can select this edge here, and now I can move this element along this axis. Okay, we can move this element on this different plane. For example, I can select the YX plane and now I can move this element on the Y and X plane, Y and Z and so on. And we can select a plane. For example, I can select this surface as a plane and I can move this element along this plane. Okay, and I can spin it around. For example, I can select different axes, but for example I can select this axis and now I can spin this element using this axis as a reference. Okay, now I can select my second constraint, coincidence constraint, and now selecting this element, as you can see here we've got this axis enabled and we can select this second element. We've got our first constraint and now with update, this is what we've got. We've got the coincidence between these two different axes. We've got an axis for a hole and we've got an axis for our mouth, and they share the same axis. Okay, this is the idea. Now I can move this element with manipulation, but we've got this other option with respect to constraint. And now, for example, selecting as axis, as rotation axis, this axis, I can't rotate this along this axis, but you can see here I can move this element, but I can't rotate it. Okay, and let's move this. For example, let's select this element as a reference. We can move this element along this direction. Okay, and now we can use our third constraint, contact constraint. We need to select this surface. We can select this other surface here and update, and now we've got contact between these two different elements. Okay, now we can add another part. Let's add another map 2. Open. This is our map. We can move this map, and as you can see here, we've got map 2, map 2.1, map 2, map 2.2. Okay, as always, we can move this element, for example, along this direction. I can select this as direction. Okay, I can use my first constraint, coincidence constraint, and let's say coincidence between this and, for example, this, and update. Now I can move this element along this direction. Okay, and now I can use my contact constraint, selecting this surface and this surface, and update. Now we can add another part, so let's click on existing component, and we can add our clip. Open. This is our clip. As always, we can select coincidence between this axis. Let's select this surface, and as you can see, we've got this axis and this axis. Update. Okay, now I can move this along this direction, for example, because now we need to fix our second constraint. Okay, and a second constraint, we can select contact between this surface and this. Here we are. Now let's click on existing component, and we can add a Rook. Open. So we can move this element. So let's move this element along, for example, this axis here. We can select coincidence between this element and this. Update. Now we can move this element, for example, along this axis. We can select this axis here, and with respect to constraint. Okay, and let's click on OK. Now we can add our ring. So let's click on existing component, and let's click on Pulley, and we can select a ring. Open. This is a ring, and we want coincidence between this axis and this axis. Okay, now we can move this element along this direction. Okay, and now we want coincidence between this surface and this surface. Update. Let's click on existing component, let's click on Pulley, and let's click on washer. Open. We've got our washer here. Now we can select coincidence between this and this, and as you can see, we've got this condition applied. And now we can select coincidence, contact between this surface here and this surface here. Okay, and update. Now we can use our offset constraint. For example, we can select this element, we can select this surface here, we can select this surface here, and as you can see here, we can fix this position. We've got an orientation, we can change the orientation, but we can fix this distance. So let's say minus 10 as difference. Okay, and update. Let's change this value now. We can change this value, let's say, I think 7, minus 7. And okay, and update. Okay. Minus 8. Okay, and update. Okay. Now, this is the correct position. Okay. Now let's add our wheel, our first wheel. Let's select wheel, apply, and as you can see here, we can fix the position of this wheel. We can change, we can move this wheel, for example, selecting this element as reference, and okay, and with coincidence constraint, we can fix this position. We can select this axis and this axis, and let's click on update all. Okay, and now with contact constraint we can select this surface, and let's click on update. Okay, and now we can add our second wheel, and let's repeat the same procedures. So let's select, for example, coincidence between this and this, but the best way to do that is to select this element as reference. Okay, let's update. Now we can move this element. Let's move this along this direction, for example, and now we can fix this position, selecting this surface and this surface here, and update. Existing component, and let's add our math 1. This is our math. We can move this element, for example, along this direction, and okay. And with coincidence constraint, we can select this element and this circle here. So we've got this axis enabled, and now we can fix the position with contact constraint, selecting this and this, and let's update. Okay, now let's add math 3. This is our element. We can move this element along this direction. Okay, we can select coincidence constraint, selecting as always the reference, this element and this, and then selecting update. And now we can select coincidence between this and this, and update. Now let's add our join. This is our element. We can move this element, for example, selecting this element, and let's click on OK. And now let's, using this element, our coincidence constraint, selecting this, and let's click on update. Now let's click on contact constraint, and we can fix this position, these two different elements. Let's click on update. We can rotate this element. For example, I can select manipulation. I can select rotation with respect to constraint and select this element. And now I can rotate this element, for example, in this position. Let's click on OK. Now we can add our second math1. So let's click on Pulley, let's click on math1, and let's click on OK. This is our math. As you can see, we can move this element along this direction. So let's select movement and we can move this element. Let's click on coincidence between this element. And now we need to select this element as reference and let's click on update. Contact constraint between this and this. Update. Okay. And now we need a second base, so we can click on existing component and on our pooling, and we can add a base. But as you can see here, opening this component, we've got coincidence between our second base and our first base. So we've got coincidence between these two different elements. So let's undo that. And we've got our other option, existing component with positioning. Clicking on this, I can add our base, but I can move this element here. And clicking on OK, now I can fix the position between these different elements. To do that, I can select this element, our first math, and with the right click I can hide this element. And I can select this other math here. With the right click I can select hide and show. Now I can fix this position. Let's say coincidence between this and this, and a second condition we can fix. We can say coincidence between this and this, and update. Okay, and now we can fix this position, selecting this surface here and this surface here, and let's click on update, and this is the right position. We can hide our first math and our second math. Okay, and let's add another base with existing component. Let's select Pulley and let's click on base and open, and we can move this element on this direction, along this direction for example, and let's click on OK. As always, we can hide this element, hide and show. We can hide this other element here, our math 3, hide and show, and we can fix the position selecting this element here and this hole here, and we can select this element and this element here, and let's update. Now we can fix the position with contact constraint between this and this, and let's update. Okay, now we can hide our first month, hide and show, and hide and show. Okay, let's click on existing component with positioning, and now selecting our pulley we can add our first arm, open. We can move our arm, for example, this is our arm, and let's click on OK. As always, we can fix, we want coincidence between this element and is this correct? No, I don't think so. And this time. Okay, let's update. Okay, we can rotate this element, selecting for example this all as a reference, and we can rotate this element. This is the correct position. So we can fix this other coincidence between this element and this element. And let's update. Okay. And now with contact constraint, we can fix the position of our first arm, clicking on update. Okay. Let's add our second arm. Let's click on arm, open, and we can click on OK. As always, we want coincidence between this and this. So let's select coincidence. Let's select our first element. Close. This and this. And let's update. Now let's rotate this element, selecting, for example, this circle here as reference. Okay. And with our coincidence constraint, let's select this element and this element, and let's click on update. And as always, contact constraint between this and this, and update. Okay. Now let's introduce with movement, as always, our first pin. Open. And OK. We want coincidence between this element and this hole here. Let's click on update. OK. And as you can see here, we can move this element, for example, selecting manipulation, selecting translation, and selecting this axis as reference. We can move this element. Okay. And we can fix this position. Okay. And clicking on offset constraint, we can select this surface, for example, and this surface. As you can see here, we can change direction. But we can change the orientation. As you can see here, we've got same, and we can select opposite. And for example, we can select as offset, let's say -8, and OK, and update. Now we double click on our constraint, because we've got here a constraint. We can select this with double click, and in more we can change the orientation. Let's say same, and let's click on OK and update. And this is the right position. Okay. As you can see here, we've got our constraint under our specification tree. Okay. Now we can add our second pin. Let's click on pin. This is our pin. We can fix, for example, selecting this element and this element. And let's click on this. And as you can see here, we can, with our offset constraint, we can select this surface and this element. And as you can see here, we've got it as reference, and we can click on OK. This is the correct position. Now we can add our third pin. Let's click on open. As always, we can select coincidence between this axis and this hole here, and let's update. And let's fix this position with our offset constraint, selecting this and this. As you can see here, we've got 8, and let's click on OK. Well, of course, we can change the orientation, but we already see whether it depends. So let's click on OK, and here we are. And this is our first assembly design. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this content, as always, please consider to subscribe, share, and so on. See you soon.